my strong suspicion is that with that, dysbiosis that occurs with aging, their gut microbiome's not doing the job it needs to do to optimize NAD levels in the body either.
You are tuned into the Dr. Tina Show with Dr. Tina Moore. For more, visit drtyna.com. On this episode of the Dr. Tina Show, I am excited to bring you Dr. Greg Kelly. Dr. Greg is an expert when it comes to the fields of longevity, of senolytic cells, of regenerative medicine, and we've had him on the pod before, and you guys loved it. And so I brought him back on because if you've ever heard of NAD or the use of NAD in longevity, then you're going to love this episode. First off, I've been using this molecule professionally and personally for years, but I had so many questions. So when I had the chance to bring Dr. Greg back on and pick his brain all about NAD and longevity and how can it help me look and feel fabulous as I get older, you bet I grabbed it. So we dove into it. We talked about how NAD declines as we age, why it's such a critical nutrient when it comes to our overall energy production, and how we can all benefit from utilizing NAD precursors when it comes to stimulating our natural NAD. Plus, we're going to dive into the science of it. We're going to get nerdy, as Dr. Greg and I always do, and you're going to hear why Qualia's NAD Plus is a non-negotiable in his longevity stack. So without further ado, let's jump in. Dr. Greg, thank you for coming back on the Dr. Tina Show. I had you on, last year sometime, and we talked about senescent zombie cells, and that was so fascinating. And so today we are going to dive into NAD, and I have so many questions for you. So thanks for coming back on the show.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm thrilled to be back and talking about something that I love nerding out about NAD and what we can do to improve it.
Yeah. So you're a naturopathic physician, and last time we definitely nerded out. So I'm sure we'll have another great conversation today. I get asked about this all the time, NAD, and my background knowledge on NAD was using it subcutaneously. We hear about NAD IVs, we hear about it for longevity, and I have so many questions, and we're gonna dig into them. So first off, what is NAD plus, and how is it used in the body?
Yeah. So NAD plus would be what I think of as a hub molecule in cells and mitochondria, meaning it's if you were to think of our airline system, it would be like a big airport like a Chicago or Dallas that a lot of other molecules depend on to get where they're going inside cells. And when I would have taken biochemistry, 93, I think, was my first year at naturopathic school, I would have learned that NAD had a couple of really important jobs. One, it's absolutely essential to make ATP, the energy our mitochondria pump out so that cells can do work. NAD, kind of, for listeners, think of it as something that carries the electrons or stored energy in food and allows them to be made into energy in mitochondria. So that's one job. NAD can also accept a phosphate molecule and become something called NADP or NAD. It's actually NADP plus or NADPH. That role that I learned way back when was about building molecules, but especially molecules like glutathione that are used for cellular defense purposes and detoxification. So think of that as another category of jobs that NAD molecule does. It's a big player in keeping our cells able to deal with stress and to help us as people detoxify things and have good antioxidants defense systems. And then what happened late 90s, early 2000s with work, I think it was out of an MIT lab, but it was the names are people like David Sinclair, who I'm sure some listeners will have heard of, Leo Guarenti, who ran the lab at the time. I think Charles Brenner was another one touched in with that. But what they eventually found was that the NAD molecule had a completely different role than I learned about, and then those two. And they're sometimes described as consumption roles. But the way to think of it is that NAD molecule is used to activate certain enzyme systems in the body. And part of that process is the molecule gets broken apart. So it gets consumed. And sirtuins would be the enzyme system. David Sinclair, still talks a lot about that. And think of it in that context, the NAD molecule is fuel to drive those sirtuin systems. And for listeners, sirtuins on a cellular level are really involved with allowing cells to respond resiliently to all kinds of stress. So think of that as a important job, and one clearly that's super important as we get older, but as our cells get older. And then once they had found that, they found that other roles that will also fit in that, NAD being used as fuel, like being devoured to fuel an enzyme. Another one of those are called PARPs, but PARPs are enzymes that repair DNA. So obviously, again, super important for healthy aging. So that new discovery of these consumption purposes is, I think, lit the imagination of the researchers thinking, okay, maybe NAD is way more important for longevity than the biochemistry books would have taught me way back. And around 2013, and this was David Sinclair's lab, used NMN at the time. NMN would be a precursor, something that our cells can use to make the NAD molecule. And when he gave that to older, I believe it was mice, but rodents of some kind, they just aged healthier. Their hair was more glossy, they stayed leaner, they were more active. And that study was the tipping point for then really, I think, lighting the fuse, so to speak, under the NAD bonfire and getting research and researchers to start to do a lot of work on that molecule.
Okay, so I have some questions on this.
Yeah.
Sirtuins, they're NAD dependent, right? Like those
Correct.
Can't go without the NAD being there. I remember that. And then, it's like going back to 1993, I do remember, I just originally remember learning it for the Krebs cycle, right? The hydrogen came off, the hydrogen went on as it went around the Krebs cycle.
Correct. Yeah, that would be that first, that ATP role as the carrier of our electrons. And that shifting between the NAD plus and NADH, in biochemistry, that's called a redox reaction. But in that reaction, the molecule, the NAD core is unchanged. It's just gaining and losing electrons, kind of toggling back and forth. But that NAD dependent sirtuins that you mentioned, that's what I mean by consumption. And in that role, the NAD molecule is broken into pieces. And that's one of the reasons we need more of that than, say, like the vitamin B2 molecule that's involved in the Krebs cycle. Which is why if you look on your supplement facts in a multivitamin, 100% of the DV on vitamin B3 is a lot more than it would be for vitamin B2. Okay. Because while they both are involved in that Krebs cycle piece, NAD and those dependent things is consumed.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. What is the difference between NAD plus and NMR?
You mean NMN?
NMN, I'm sorry. NMN is just a precursor?
Yeah. So there's different ways to make the NAD molecule. There's two main pathways to make it. One is called the Price-Handler pathway. And listeners probably know that many things in medicine and biology are named after whoever discovered them. So no surprise, Price and Handler were the two scientists that I think it was the late 30s discovered how the Flushing niacin, nicotinic acid, could be made into NAD. And the reason that a lot of research emphasis went into it then was because of the vitamin B3 deficiency disease that was really very prevalent in the early 1900s. So they were trying to figure out both how to cure that deficiency disease and then how vitamin B3 was metabolized. But so think of the Flushing niacin, sometimes called nicotinic acid, kind of comes in through its own doorway and eventually makes NAD. The other classic vitamin B3 is called niacinamide. Niacinamide is then made into NMN, and then NMN is made into NAD in its own pathway. That's called the salvage pathway. And then NR was much more newly figured out. NR can either be made into niacinamide and then to NMN or go directly to NMN. So it kind of is its own new doorway to make NMN and then ultimately NAD. Okay. And so one of the things I know that I believe when cells have multiple ways of doing something, then I, as more of a holistic thinker, want to support all three. So rather than just give, let's just give NR, nicotinamide riboside, I would want to let's give a little bit of the Flushing niacin, and let's give some of the niacinamide, and let's give some of the nicotinamide riboside, because they all kind of come in their own unique ways to support cells in making it. And it seems like some cells have a preference for one form over others.
Yeah, that makes sense. So yeah, just sort of like give them the orchestra to do the thing.
Yeah, and they'll figure it out, right? If my bias has always been a big part of health, isn't necessarily trying to control what cells or tissues do, but give them the resources they need and remove the obstacles for them using them. And then usually they'll figure it out, right? They evolve to be way smarter in terms of getting their needs met than we'll probably ever know as scientists.
That's very naturopathic of you.
Thank you.
Remove the obstacles to cure, right? That
Absolutely.
Yep, and give the body what it needs and let it do its thing. Okay, so for the listeners, B3 is niacin. Just so the listeners know, and when he's talking about B vitamins and then niacin, that's B3. And then the deficiency, that was Pellagra. I remember, right? Isn't that Pellagra?
Yeah, and we would have learned about it as the 3Ds, sometimes 4Ds, but it stood for the classic symptoms. So B3 deficiency, Pellagra, 1D was for dementia, but not in the Alzheimer's type of sense, but more in the sense like brain fog, issues with mood, that like lack of mental clarity, like really poor cognitive function in many different ways. One was dermatitis. So B3 deficiency has a really classic red scaly rash. It can also be on the tongue. And then the third D was diarrhea. And actually, it doesn't have to be deficiency, but even inadequate amounts of the molecules that make NAD tend to cause either leaning towards constipation or diarrhea. But like some kind of GI thing very commonly would show up.
This sounds a lot like a lot of elderly folks, though.
For sure. Yep. And one of the, this was a recent study, Nestle's, the food company, just sponsored a study, and what they found in animals is that niacinamide, which is another form of B3, was lower in older animals than it was in younger animals, even if the diet was kept the same. So somehow it just wasn't making its way into circulation from the diet. And human studies seem to correspond to that so far. So we need more of these things to make NAD as we get older, for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
And then the fourth D that I alluded to was death. So
you're bringing it all back. I'm remembering all of that. It's all coming. And then corn, right? If you eat too much corn, you can get Pellagra.
Yeah. So what would happen in animal foods, just like in our cells, the way to think about NAD, and usually in science, the term would be called a metabolome. And when you see that "ome" on the end of thing, think like gut microbiome. It means a collection, right? Like a grouping. And so NAD metabolome is often how it's described. And what that means is that there's the NAD, there's the NADH, there's the NADP that I mentioned. There's then the things like flushing niacin and NMN and NR that we've talked, all of those other molecules, right? So there's a collection of NAD-related molecules. The reason that's relevant, in our cells, we have that whole collection. And when we consume animal foods, they would have the whole collection. But in plants, what they usually have is something that's more like the flushing niacin form, but bound up with fibers. And so it's not really very bioavailable. So like in a general sense, we eat animal foods, we get the whole collection of all the different molecules. But in corn, you'd only be getting that bound up form of vitamin B3. And when corn in the Native American traditions that were very corn dependent was used as a staple food, they always processed it with limestone, alkali lime. And that both changes the calcium amount in, say, tortillas or corn, but it liberates that bound niacin so that it's available to use. And so what happened in the early 1900s is parts of the South where corn was a staple food, but didn't process it in that old way, where functionally became B3 deficient because they couldn't get what was in the food and they weren't eating enough animal products to make up the difference.
Yep. I'm remembering all of this. And I remember that dementia described as people just not making sense. Like
Correct.
People start not making sense. They get the dermatitis, they get the diarrhea, which sounds like a lot of our aging population.
Yeah. It was that like lack of mental clarity, right? But usually with a mood component that was overlaid with it. And what you would tend to see with most things that would be vitamin deficiencies is when there's not an outright deficiency, but not an optimal amount, you have lesser degrees of some of those same types of issues going on. So what we tend to see at Qualia when people have been in our studies on the Qualia NAD Plus product is the areas that most commonly we've seen improve the most are feelings of energy, mood, mental clarity, the same category of things that you tend to see if in a deficiency go really, really haywire.
That's awesome. Yeah, because I think B vitamin deficiencies across the board are so prevalent. And some of these get used up when we're in stress states. Some of the Bs get used up in the face of toxicity. I mean, it's just this general world we live in. And I think we're all running pretty low B vitamin. And we can get them from animal foods and from other sources. But I think that the deficiency state or the state of just not having optimal, it's not even deficiency. It's just optimizing the cell, right? Like optimizing the individual. Sometimes we can talk about like RDAs and all of that, but I'm less interested. And I know you as an naturopathic doctor are too. It's like, we're just trying to get people back to homeostasis and whatever they need. And I think this is a big one. We only really learned about it, I think, for the most part, aside from that frank deficiency state was flushing niacin in the case of cardiovascular support. And so like this whole new world of longevity and anti-aging, like this is all newer.
Yeah. The other area, well, there's many more, but flushing niacin has always been part of the sauna detox protocol with that Scientology has used, which is one of the more studied types of detox, actually. And, the idea behind that is that the flushing niacin works in a certain way on fat cells. It tends to mobilize things that were stored there, including we store most of the fat soluble toxins, obviously, there. So that's why I said, in addition to the NAD role, that these different forms also have slight unique roles that they play. And one is, this was also a recent Nestle study, but it was, they were trying to figure out if any of these types of vitamin B3 or the NAD precursors could increase the function of the stem cells in muscles, which are called satellite cells, muscle satellite cells. And what they found was that niacinamide worked, but NR didn't. And it was because NAD wasn't involved. Niacinamide was used in a completely different way that science hadn't known about before, that didn't involve being made into NAD first. Since NR is made into NAD slightly better and easier than niacinamide, it wasn't nearly as good for this muscle stem cell role as niacinamide was. So, which I thought was super cool. And it made me very pleased that we have both in, what I would think of as amounts that help optimize function in Qualia NAD+.
Yes, that's the key, optimizing function. So we talked about frank deficiency, which is obviously not the norm, but what are some signs of just waning NAD levels as we age? Like, say someone like myself, I'm 50 years old. What are some of the more common symptoms that we're seeing, or just presentations? And then how does that reflect into anti-aging or longevity?
Let's touch first on the longevity piece, and then we'll go backtrack into some clues maybe that you could need more. But in a general sense, there's a framework called the hallmarks of aging that's used a lot in longevity. And hallmarks of aging means there's certain characteristics, and there's 12 of them currently that are used, that whether scientists are looking at a mouse or a monkey or a human, we would have in common as we get older. And these are things like mitochondria dysfunction and DNA having issues replicating correctly, and telomeres becoming shorter and stem cells being exhausted. Another one is dysbiosis, which has to do with kind of the health and integrity of our gut. Another one's inflammaging is how we would usually refer to it. But that low level inflammation that gradually gets more and more with the passing of time in all organisms. And so NAD has been connected to all 12 of those, some much more strongly than others. So as an example, obviously you had mentioned earlier, Krebs cycle that takes place in mitochondria. NAD is critical for helping to counter that mitochondrial dysfunction. I mentioned its role in the enzymes that repair DNA, right? So it's really critical in that one as well. This new role of niacinamide in muscle stem cells is there's a connection now with not necessarily NAD, but it's precursor molecules with stem cells. And so there's a strong case to be made that we need NAD to counter all of these hallmarks of aging. And one of the other things that then came about from research is when they investigate, whether it's humans or other animals, the levels of NAD decrease in our tissues with age. So not only do we need it, but it just turns out that as we get older, we have much less in our tissues and cells where we need it to counter aging than we did when we were younger. So that's like, there's many more nuances to that, but that's the main story, that it's super important for keeping us healthy as we get older. And for whatever reason, our cells aren't very good at making enough of it. And so there was a study, I think I saw it about 3 months ago, and it looked at compared NAD levels in red blood cells at different ages. And then with people that were either sedentary people, high level runners, some of the runners were long distance, some were more sprinters, and then looked at how NAD levels were over time. And no surprise, the exercises had, for whatever age they were at, much higher levels of NAD than the sedentary folks.
The runners had higher levels.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the sprinters actually higher than the long distance runners in this particular study. But even within those, it was like a line down over time with age. So they stayed higher, but they still went down. So exercise was useful, but it didn't counteract all the declines with aging that happened with NAD.
Wow. So why do you think it goes down over time? Is it malnourishment? Is it lack of precursors, or?
So I think there's multiple different reasons, but one would be tie in with inflammation. So there's another NAD dependent or NAD consuming enzyme called CD38. For listeners, just think of it as like a chronic inflammation enzyme. And that's a huge devourer of the NAD molecule as we get older. And some animal evidence would indicate on its own that that's sufficient to cause NAD levels to go down as we get older, like just that chronic inflammation piece. We talked about zombie cells the last time I was on. So senescent cells, it turns out, as we talked about then, accumulate more and more in our tissues as we get older, and they become big devourers of NAD. So they kind of rob NAD from their local ecosystem and devour it as well. So we have those two pieces. My guess is that some's probably dietary when you start to get to extremes of aging, right? Because people sometimes just don't make as healthy a food, as they get older compared to what they might have had access to younger. And then some part is for sure we're less efficient at turning the things like flushing niacin or NR into NAD. The enzymes that do the work, they don't work as well as we get older.
Wow. So inflammation is just, that's what I was trying to get at with the B vitamins across the board. When you're in a toxic and or inflamed state, you start to chew through your B vitamins. Well, all your nutrients, all your micronutrients and macronutrients too. You start to eat them up because that inflammation is just literally burning through them.
Yeah. And then I think that we'll probably find out that the gut microbiome has a lot to do with it as well.
I'm sure. Yeah. Absorption and just conversion in the gut. That's got to be a player.
The one research group has done 2 studies on it. Both were in rats, so that doesn't necessarily translate to humans. But what they found in those 2 studies, when they gave nicotinamide riboside orally, great NAD booster, that for that to work and boost NAD levels in the liver, certain gut microbiomes had to interact with it and turn it into the flushing form of niacin. And then most of what got absorbed from that lower part of the GI tract was the flushing form of niacin. And if they did things to eliminate those good gut bacteria, then NR wasn't as useful to boost NAD levels. So the other thing that's been super clear is that NR, niacinamide, flushing niacin all interact slightly differently with the gut microbiome. So think of the gut microbiome, which on average, maybe, yours has 5,000 different species. Mine would have 5,000. Some we would share, some would be different, but they're all depending on us for their food supply. And just like us, if they don't get enough of these precursors, they'll be deficient and have issues. So my strong suspicion is that with that, dysbiosis that occurs with aging, their gut microbiome's not doing the job it needs to do to optimize NAD levels in the body either.
I never thought about my microbiome being deficient themselves.
Yeah, they rely on us for everything. Like magnesium, right, is super important in all the energy production pathways. And if we're not getting enough, they're not getting enough. So, and the same with the B vitamins and the NAD precursors. So yeah, we're always eating for literally trillions.
It's true. I never thought I'm starving them as well. I always think of them as either alive or dead. I don't think of them as nutrient deficient. So, I don't want to starve my little bugs. I always say to eat an interesting diet so that it keeps it interesting for your biome, right? Your bugs need interesting food too. They need something to chew on that's different and unique and interesting along the way. If you feed them the same things every day, some of them die off because they're bored. I know that's not that simplistic, but that's how I describe it to patients, because I'm like, I don't know. I don't think you could live off of just only one food group. Like some of the, these extreme diets are popular online,
The microbiome is flexible within some constraints for sure. And, so really quickly, when we dramatically change our diet, you'll start to see shifts in maybe not what is there, but the quantity of it, right? Will cause certain ones to be outcompeted, so to speak. And, oftentimes over time will cause some species to go extinct. And we don't want that to happen. We want to keep a lot of diversity in our microbiome.
Yeah, for sure. So let's go back though. So we've got frank deficiency of, pellagra. And then there's this idea of just declining NAD levels, the hallmarks of aging. So that's what we're going to start to see. Those 12 things you listed, those are the things, because people aren't going to know whether their mitochondria are working or not. I mean, they might feel symptomatic of something, but like, what are some things that one might notice?
Yeah, so I always work backwards from what are the good things we see when we give it to people, and like what are the things where they tell us they notice the difference. And the most common thing, without question, that we've seen in our studies when we measure changes in NAD levels is people reporting more energy. Like, so not, energy in the ATP sense, but energy like anti-fatigue. Like there's something there, like, and maybe because we're making more ATP, maybe because more that, that dementia thing, right? That had to do with how our brain was functioning. So energy, feeling less fatigue, number one thing I see all the time. A second area that's super common is the mood category of things, right? So, and by that, I don't mean just depression or anxiety, but irritability, nervousness, again, like those cognitive things, because those mood things, really it's our brain that's, or the gut-brain axis, but both that interact there. So that would be the other, number two big category, just better emotional resilience and feeling like our emotions aren't running away with us, that we are more the driver of the ship. And all these emotions are appropriate in the right context. It's just when they're starting to be our constant companions as opposed to when we need them to express themselves.
I love that. Like that version of just your emotions running away from us. That really nails it, because as I have aged, I have noticed that my tolerance bands are getting shorter and shorter. And I know that part of that's hormonal, and I know part of it is just getting older and, having better boundaries. But there are times when I don't lose my cool. Actually, I'm better at keeping my cool. But sometimes, that's it. The emotions sort of run away from you and you potentially ruminate on them or whatnot. And it doesn't always feel as under control as it used to be. I know when I'm feeling good is when things are rolling off me, just no problem, right? Versus me locking in and sort of fixating on something. That's when I know I need something in that moment. I either need exercise, I need nutrition, I need sun, something like that will usually help alleviate that. So that makes sense that it would be a malnourishment.
Yeah, and I use the idea of resilience, like that would get at what you're talking about. Like, oh, I'm resilient. Like I was able to respond well to this, whatever this stressful situation was. But just like our whole body, our cells, they need to be resilient, right? Because they're getting stressed all the time, often by many of the same things listeners are, right? Toxins, radiation, poor nutrition, you name it. And Charles Brenner, I mentioned that name earlier. He's one of the premier NAD researchers, has done a lot of the work on nicotinamide riboside. And what he told me when I interviewed him at one point is his belief was the main plus of maintaining higher levels of NAD plus as we age is so that cells could be more resilient, so that when they get metabolically stressed, they'll be able to deal with it. And when that's the case, then they don't take on the damage that causes them to become zombie cells, as an example. Right?
Yes.
So we want cells to have plenty of NAD in their bank account, so to speak, to be able to spend when they get stressed.
That makes so much sense, because a stress cell is a metabolically compromised cell, is an inflamed cell.
And then, then I guess shifting gears back, another category would be sleep, that I see people very commonly, when we do things to increase their NAD levels, mention that they feel like they're getting better quality sleep.
Would they note it? Would this be like frank sleep disruption, or would this be more subtle in that they wake up, they supposedly are sleeping fine, but they're waking up feeling unrefreshed, or maybe they're tracking their sleep with a ring or some such gadget, and they are seeing their sleep architecture go sideways? Like, is this impacting anything specific?
In our studies, when we polled the people that have commented about sleep, it's been more that sense that their sleep is more restorative. They just aren't as fatigued during the day. They feel less sleepy. It doesn't necessarily track with Oura rings or other things, but it may for an individual. But
okay.
It's more that restorative piece. And then the fourth area I hear a lot, in part because at Qualia, we tend to have a lot of high performers and athletes that we interact with, is the sense that they are able to rebound quicker from exercise.
That's a big deal, actually. Let's talk about that a little bit and what some of those mechanisms might be, because the older I get, the more intensely sore I am after exercise. I'm getting sorer and sorer and sorer as I get older. And I'm like, what is going on? And I realize, again, some of that's hormonal. And as I get my hormones supplemented appropriately, it tends to resolve somewhat, but it is a thing. And I know that some of us have a genomic profile that's going to lead us more towards post-exercise soreness. But I really feel like there's something to the actual aging process that is contributing, and I'm not digging it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it gets one part inflammation, right? As we get older, we tend to make a lot more inflammatory molecules from exercise. So even good things. I know in animals, a really intense workout in a young animal will maybe create a few zombie cells, but then they're gone within, say, a week. In an old animal, there's much more like an explosion of them, a huge number, and they linger. Right?
Oh.
So even exercise, if we overdo it when we get older, we're much more likely to be harmed by that than we are when we're younger. And then I think other things play a role. Stem cells, which is a passion of yours, right? They get exhausted as we get older, so they tend to. The ones that we have, which tend up being more in a quiescent state, when they do get active, they're not as active or as good at performing their functions, which ties in again to that niacinamide form of B3 as an NAD precursor. And that's one of the reasons I thought that study that I mentioned was so cool, because it helped increase the function of muscle stem cells. And then that resulted in repair and regeneration of muscles quicker. So I think that tie into many of the different hallmarks is where NAD starts to weave together into that recovery, because whether it's inflammation or stem cells or repairing DNA, it's just a player in so many key parts of how cells perform at their best.
This is making me want to take my NAD plus supplement more regularly.
I took the Qualia NAD Plus first thing this morning. I also believe the best time to take things that help our body make NAD is early in our day. So like one of the strange things to me, I don't know if this would be the same with you, but the default often is, just take this 2 or 3 times a day, like take it at breakfast and dinner, or take, some at breakfast, some at lunch, some at dinner. And many things, because of our body clock, have a better, like a good time to take them and a maybe less good time to take them. And often that hasn't been looked at. Certainly it's not in most cases been looked at nearly as much as it merits. And with the NAD molecule, it was looked at in what I thought was a really cool animal study. And so what they did is, one of the reasons there was some excitement going back to David Sinclair's work in 2013 is boosting NAD over and over in different animal experiments improved their metabolic health. And by that, like lipids and blood sugar and insulin and those types of things. So in this study, they did the equivalent of an NAD IV at the beginning of the animal's active cycle. So that would be, for me as a human, they'd be like when the sun rises, more or less. And when they gave the NAD molecules, then it improved metabolic health. So then I thought, all right, well, let's give them instead 12 hours later at the beginning of their inactive cycle, when it gets dark. And it actually worsened all those things.
Really? Yeah. So morning is the ticket.
And then that was doing the IV. So then they said, all right, well, let's give just the niacinamide form of vitamin B3, also timed. And they found the same thing, that when niacinamide was given at the beginning of their active cycles, it improved metabolic health, but it worsened it later. And so this would just be my belief. It's obviously imperfect. It's an animal study. We don't have the data in humans, but we both have similar body clocks and are circadian organisms. So until more is known, rather than being willy-nilly with when I take my NAD precursors, I'm really intentional and always take Qualia NAD Plus in the morning.
Okay. So red light in the morning is better too. So I'm going to stack them and I'm going to do it religiously, and I'm going to get back to you because that's really compelling. It makes sense. You don't want to be, it's clearly that means there's something strong to do with your circadian rhythm, which we don't want to be messing with. So people don't get that. Our circadian rhythm isn't just from the outside light. It is to some degree, but hot and cold, certain nutrients, all of those are going to impact circadian rhythm. So
yeah, meal timing's really profoundly impactful on it as well. We have our central body clock in our brain, but then our liver has its own body clock, and the liver one isn't as set by light, and it is more set by food timing.
Yeah.
And ideally, we want everything to be synchronized. We want our body to be the equivalent of a beautiful symphony, not like discordant music. And so, when we mistime things, we're more likely to get, discordant noise than a beautiful orchestra playing.
That makes sense. I will pay attention to that. I do admittedly take it mamsy-pamsy when I take it. And I also have been a bit mamsy-pamsy with my red light. So one of my commitments to myself was for the new year was to get my red light in the morning and not necessarily at night, although I do sleep great with my red light at night. But NAD plus in the morning, you guys have gifted me a bottle of that, and I need to be more diligent with the morning timing, and then I'm going to stack it with my red light. Is there any utility to that? It seems like it would optimize. Do we know anything about that?
I've not. I recently interviewed for our podcast at Qualia the person that founded MitoRed, which is a red light and near infrared. And I asked him about timing, and really his main takeaway was just most of us would benefit from some red light. It's less important the when.
Okay.
And so, but red light, is it red light? I think it's the near infrared that gets all the way to our mitochondria, right? That penetrates more. Anyways, both of them are good for our mitochondria, and NAD is so important for that. So, if red light makes our mitochondria perform better, think of that as what we talked about, right? Now you're removing an obstacle to using the things that help our cells make NAD.
Okay. I did interview a red light guy, BioLite was the company, and Dr. Mike, and he was telling me about a study of that red light in the morning improved mitochondrial function, and it did not have the same impact at night. So I think that this might. I mean, I'm wondering if there's.
Yeah.
I'm all for stacking. I'm all for loading up before I hit myself with a red light, hit myself with the methylene blue and all that jazz. And I think that we're photosynthesizing beings. Anything I can get light working with my cells.
Yep. And I tend to also think, if we give people really clear instructions when to do something, they're much more likely to fit it in their life than if we're vague. Like, oh, yeah, but I know even for me, if for listeners, at one point in my early adult life, I was an officer in the Navy. And so time was a crazy prized commodity when we were out at sea, between my job, standing watches. And if I had a 40-minute window to exercise and didn't take advantage, there wasn't going to be another 40-minute window that rolled around that day. That was it. Either do it or don't do it. And what I remember finding routinely at that point in my life would be I would invariably do the exercise when I had that minimum window and had to do it. But if I had all day on a Saturday, I might never get to it. Right. Because I can put it in anytime. So I think for something like a new habit, like red light, it makes huge amount of sense to me to commit to, I'm going to do this first thing in my morning, maybe before I have my, coffee, for coffee drinkers that are listeners, or some really concrete, this is where it's going to fit into my, life, and it's going to become my habit in this window of time.
Got to schedule it. Speaking of which, how does coffee interact with NAD+?
That's a great question. So to make these precursors, fleshing niacin, NR, NMN, niacinamide, into NAD, there's multiple enzymes and sometimes different enzymes. But the final enzyme, the last step, no matter where you start, is the enzyme's acronym is NMNAT for listeners. But there's three variants of that. There's one that's really active in our nervous system, our brain and neurons, as an example. There's another version that's more active in our liver. But the brain version, caffeine actually makes that enzyme more active. So caffeine on its own would, if there's the building blocks to make NAD, caffeine would increase the amount of NAD available. So in the Qualia NAD Plus, we actually put a micro dose of a coffee fruit extract to have that little bit of caffeine, because we want to always support the enzymes that are doing these important jobs to move the molecules further in their progression to get to NAD.
Perfect. So coffee isn't going to negate the efforts. It will add that to the morning stack.
No, it would it would the actual study. So this was in vitro, which mechanistic studies are always done first on cells. But yeah, they actually combined they gave nicotinamide riboside, caffeine, or the combination of the two, and looked at neurons' ability to make NAD, and the two were additive.
Fantastic. So it is a stack.
Yep.
I'm going to find some data to show that red light helps this too. I'll get back to you on that. I'm going to justify all of my morning habits. So tell me about the Qualia NAD Plus booster that I am taking haphazardly and not at the right time of day. So these are precursors and boosters to generate NAD Plus in the body.
Yeah. So there's, think of Qualia NAD Plus as having two categories of nutrients. One would be the building blocks. So we have nicotinamide riboside, which is the most studied way to boost NAD+. We've got both old forms of B3, the niacinamide, the one that I mentioned earlier, does something in muscle stem cells that the other B3s don't do. And then we have a small amount of the fleshing niacin. An amount usually that's low enough you wouldn't think people would flush, but what we see is we do get occasionally people that will experience flushing from Qualia NAD+. And niacin flushing usually means you feel somewhere mild tingling, usually like your forehead, cheeks, sometimes neck. And someone that has a really strong flushing reaction, it can feel more like a slight allergy attack. So if anyone's ever heard of a niacin flush, that's what it means. And then the other category of things we have are things that support cells in turning those building blocks into the finished molecule, NAD. And one of the things that I thought was crazy interesting when I started looking at how cells make NAD is, one, there's these 3 different ways of making it. Each one has anywhere between 2 and 3 steps, and each step in all the pathways always needs magnesium, always. And part of the, you would know, ATP, it turns out, is used in all of those enzymes. And in our cells, ATP is always complexed with magnesium when it's doing its work. Yep. Which is one of the reasons why when we don't have enough magnesium, which is crazy common, super common in inadequacy, our metabolism goes down, our energy, like our cognition, all these things impact because magnesium just plays such a profound role in cellular energy. So, no surprise, since magnesium is so important, we put some magnesium in our product. I mentioned the role caffeine has in synergizing with NR to make NAD. So we have a small amount of that coffee fruit extract. Resveratrol is something, again, David Sinclair talks a lot about, but resveratrol is something that works on after that NAD-dependent step where I mentioned the NAD molecule is consumed or broken apart. We have to reassemble it, and resveratrol helps support that.
Okay.
Kind of like, it's called recycling or salvaging. And so we have that in there. So that would be the other reason. And then the third thing is we have all the other B vitamins, and we get them from a fermented yeast extract. And the reason goes back to that idea of ATP. Like, we started off, I think, early in this hour talking about the Krebs cycle and how important NAD is for making ATP. But as I just mentioned, without ATP, we just literally can't make NAD. And so we put the whole B complex in there, but more lower amounts of them, because all the B vitamins are needed to turn food into ATP. So we wanted to, in addition to supporting NAD with Qualia NAD+, we really wanted to support our ability to make ATP as well.
So based on the B vitamins and the flushing niacin, do you suggest people take this or utilize this around food? I mean, that's a big question that I get with B vitamins and with any, flushing niacin. I haven't had that experience with it, and I'm a sensitive girl, and I don't do well with B vitamins. So whatever this formula is, maybe it's the low amounts of everything or just the right ratios that it is serving me well. But what do you have to say on that?
Usually when you think about flushing niacin, it's the more of that you take, the more likely someone will flush. So at a 30 milligram dose in studies, you'd see almost no flushing. At 500 milligrams, probably half the people would flush. And the Qualia NAD+ is 20 milligrams. So we're below the amount where we would expected, frankly, anyone to flush, but we do see it. And I think some of that is the gut microbiome converting some of these other types into the flushing form.
Okay.
And if your gut microbiome is different than mine, someone who's having that, my guess is if we were to study them, they have organisms in their gut zoo, so to speak, that are making that conversion. Because the amount that's in the product shouldn't cause flushing.
Is the benefits of the product going to be negated, though, if there's food in the stomach?
No. So, in nature, we would have always got our B vitamins as part of food.
Right.
So, and it's fine. Like, I'm from a GI perspective, I can take most supplements without food and be fine. But B vitamins, classically, as a naturopath, are things that can, mildly upset a lot of people's stomachs if they take them without food. So if that's, a listener, if they're more sensitive, then by all means, it's a plus in general to take them with food, because there'd be other, niacin precursor molecules in what you're eating.
Okay, good.
But if it's convenient to someone and they tolerate it well and want to take it, like as an example, someone's doing intermittent fasting, they, listen to what you and I said, decide, okay, I want to take my Qualia NAD Plus early in the morning when I do my red light, but I don't want to eat until later in the morning. Is it okay if I take it? And the answer would be yes, as long as you're tolerating it well.
Okay, good answer. That's important because I always tell people to take B vitamins with food. So, and I don't just understanding the mechanism of this, I didn't want to negate the goodness of it if food was going to, waylay that. So good to know either or works. And there was clinical data on this too, right?
Yeah. So one of the things at Qualia, before we ever make and sell a product, we always do what I think of as like a couple steps of studies. But the first step is Dr. Greg being a guinea pig. So I would have made what became Qualia NAD Plus, and me and another naturopath on the team took it and measured our NAD levels before and after.
Oh, okay.
And mine went up 100 and I think it was 149%. It was in the ballpark of 150% over 23 days, which was cool. That was a big increase. The other doctor, his was about 50%. And so like, all right, seems like we are onto something. This is doing what we, hoped it would do. So then we made enough and had volunteers be part of what we would refer to as a pilot study, meaning there was no placebo group. And so we're just measuring how they respond compared to where they started. And we asked a lot of questions related to aging. So we use questionnaires we call the aging male and aging female symptom scales, but they ask questions about cognition and about sex drive and about physical function. So things like sleep and inflammation and things on those areas. And we saw big changes between before and after. So, and we also then always are looking to, are people having poor reactions, right? We want to make sure that whatever formula we're working on is tolerated well. So, it passed that, we made it, we brought it to the market, and then decided, okay, let's do a bigger study where we're measuring NAD levels compared to placebo. And the first study we saw, I want to say it was a 74% increase in NAD in the people taking Qualia NAD Plus, and virtually no change in the placebo group. So then we did another study with even more people, and in that one it was a 67% increase. So we've done now 2 placebo-controlled studies. In both of them, we've seen big increases happen over the equivalent of about 4 weeks. And we also, in the women that participated in the second study, we saw significant changes compared to placebo in energy, in mood, in the overall score for the questions related to aging as well. The men was more ambiguous, but the women really separated strongly from placebo.
Isn't that interesting? It seems like women are more sensitive to everything at the end of the day. I feel like women need a little bit less of everything than men do, but that's just me talking out loud. So, how does this, I'm interested because you have that Synolytic product that you take once a month and it clears out the senescent cells. How does this work? Is this something that people take all the time? Is it something you cycle? Like, how do you use it personally?
Yeah, so I take this most days. And the way I think about it, so one of the interesting things about senescent cells that I touched on earlier is because they're sending inflammatory things off, they're bad neighbors in our tissues, meaning they can cause nearby healthy cells to turn senescent. Part of the reason they're referred to as zombie cells. And I mentioned that connection to NAD on a cellular level being super important to allow cells to be resilient to things that stress them. So think about senescent cells as those bad neighbors that are really stressful to you. And if a cell has enough NAD in it, it's going to be able to I got this, I can handle that, without myself going crazy. But if it doesn't, then that cell's more likely now to get so stressed by that neighboring senescent cell that it will become senescent. So a main reason that I would personally take the Qualia NAD Plus, or for a listener that wants to do another NAD booster, is because we want our cells always to have plenty of NAD in their bank account in case they get stressed, which we know as we get older, zombie cells are going to cause a lot more stress on our in our tissues and in our body than a younger person. So I take the Qualia NAD Plus most of the month. I take the Qualia Synolytic always on the first weekend of the month. So, we're recording this relatively early in February. So I would have just taken the Qualia Synolytic last weekend, and I've been taking the Qualia NAD Plus, every day this week, and was taking it the days before. And so the only times I really don't take it are on those 2 days a month that I do the Synolytic. On those 2 days, I just take the Qualia Synolytic product usually.
Okay. Which is a 2 day a month protocol. And I've done that. And I like it. I mean, I like that product too. I just have been admittedly mamsy-pamsy about this one. So I'm committing. I'm going to drink my coffee in the morning like I do. I'm going to take my NAD plus, my Qualia NAD plus. I'm going to hit my red light. I'm going to tell you if that makes any difference. And I'm excited. With what you said about the exercise part, like you scared me a little bit, because as we get older, we're making more senescent cells with exercise. So like what you said there a minute ago, I don't know if people heard, the senescent cell is the bad neighbor, could turn you into the zombie too. So it makes sense to keep those cells resilient as much as possible, so you don't get turned into the zombie.
Yeah, and I absolutely want to make sure people don't confuse what I said with not exercising. We just don't want to overdo exercise. There's more of a penalty when we overdo it when we're older than. And when I was young in the Navy, I used to be an idiot with exercise and would be like, "Oh, I've just been out at sea all week. I need to do." I used to call it punishment exercise, like way overdo it. So so we just would suffer more from that as we're older. The other case that I'm intrigued by would be more that stem cell connection that's newer, right? That the niacinamide that's in Qualia NAD Plus with the muscle stem cells. Yeah. And you would be obviously an expert on stem cells, but when I think of stem cells, you often hear the idea of stem cell activity, right? So like doing like getting a stem cell therapy, we're increasing the amount of stem cells that we have available, but they still now need to proliferate and differentiate into tissues, like do these other activities. And that study didn't combine, niacinamide with stem cells, but it did show that it made the muscle stem cells more active. It allowed them to proliferate and be more differentiate into healthy muscle tissue to regenerate. So my sense is, for someone that didn't want to do a product like Qualia NAD Plus every day, but was in the stem cell world, it would probably be really advantageous to do at least things with niacinamide after stem cells for a little bit, because we want, in addition to getting the stem cells, we want to do things to help them be as active as possible.
Not prior, not necessarily to front load them and get them revved up?
Maybe. Like this study was interesting because it was only 7 days. So it didn't have like a long lead time, and it didn't have the stem cell piece. It was just looking at what happened in isolation. But B vitamins are water soluble. Right? The reason we are recommended that we take, all the B vitamins, if not every day, most days, we don't store up a lot in our tissues. So I think it would be fine taking it advanced, but I think we would need to make sure we have more than a normal amount in that post-stem cell period to get the most potential benefit, at least in our muscle tissue.
It makes sense too, in just terms of building muscle, just as we age, being able to build muscle in a healthful way, because that, although, data shows that you can build muscle at any age, which is great news, it is definitely harder as we age. And I am certain this is part of the problem, especially after everything you just told me. This is, one of the components. So making sure that we're optimizing muscle protein synthesis always, like there's no point in pounding essential amino acids and protein and lifting the heavy weights if you're going to end up super sore after and potentially making more senescent cells because you don't have enough NAD on board. So that makes a lot of sense to me, just from the terms of my listeners are like your active older person. Generally speaking, that's who listens to this show, is people middle-aged and older who are, committed to not going lightly into age.
Yeah. And what I think, like the one thing, like when I was younger, before becoming a naturopath, at least in hindsight, I view my knowledge of how the body worked as really naive, like kindergarten level for listeners, right? And like, if you had asked me early in the Navy, like, well, what do medicines do? I think I'd have answered something like, oh, they just go inside the body and fix whatever they're supposed to fix, right? Like, I don't know, like, and exercise would have been something I was equally naive. I was really good at doing exercise. I was horrible back then at allowing enough time to recover from the exercise. So I was just constantly like building and breaking down. That I think Einstein quote, you can't simultaneously prepare for war and peace. Like I was just doing the prepare, like I was doing both. I was never giving the recovery enough time. Yeah. And as we get older, I think we need more time to recover. We need more resources, like the ones we've been talking about, to recover adequately. And if not, then while exercise and enough protein can be the impetus to stimulate muscle protein synthesis, they may not be adequate to prevent the muscle protein breakdown if we're not having other resources like the things in Qualia NAD Plus, or allowing enough time.
Amen. That makes perfect sense. And I think that most people really truly believe that the magic is happening with the deadlifts and squats, but really the magic is happening in the rest and recovery. And if you don't fuel the body and give it the nutrients it needs to adequately optimize that rest and recovery, then you're kind of not getting anywhere.
Yeah. And going back to that naivete, like my original conversation in my Navy time period would have been like, oh, I get bigger and stronger because I lifted, or, whatever the activity was. Where now my story is that, oh, no. Like, I just stressed my muscles. They don't know when I'm going to stress them again. They're going to get bigger and stronger in case I stress them in the future. Right?
I like
and
that.
So that in case, that they're making a prediction, because that's really what intelligent systems do. They're always forecasting in the future and saying, all right, what do I need to do now to be better prepared for this thing that may happen again? And that preparation takes time, which I didn't allow enough of when I'm younger. And I feel at this point in my life, I'm much more attuned to like, oh, I need to do this thing to convince my body that it needs to prepare differently or factor something else, and then give it time to execute that preparation. And obviously the resources to do that.
I love it. It's like I go to bed so I can get up and drink coffee.
Yeah.
And I exercise so I can rest. That's literally where my brain's at this point, that I do the things I have to do so that I can have the things I want later. And I like resting more than I like exercising, but I don't want to rest too much because then I turn into a blob. So I'm all for active aging. And I think that this is a big piece of the puzzle that I honestly wasn't considering. I had always, to be truthful with you, Dr. David Sinclair promotes a plant-based diet, and I kind of just dismissed him with that. I was just like, oh, this is data in mice, and he's talking plant-based, and I just kind of poo-pooed it. And then I was watching all my friends do NAD IVs in their regenerative clinic, but I didn't realize how much of that was like, is it really helping, or people just adding on services to make a buck? Like, not to diss any of my friends, but it was just kind of, that's where my head was with all of that until this conversation. So I appreciate you explaining this to me. This makes a lot of sense. And it took me way back to my early biochem days in medical school. So that's fun.
Good. Well, I'm glad. So it was wonderful to get to, have such a smart and, prepared person to ask these great questions.
Well, thank you. I didn't feel as prepared as I could have been. To the listeners, poor Dr. Greg showed up and I had opened all of my preparatory notes on the wrong computer. So there we go. We'll see if the NAD Plus helps with my brain power here. I want to make sure that I let my listeners know that they can get a discount on all the wonderful products inside the Qualia store if they use the URL qualialife.com. That's QUALIA life.com /Dr. Tina. It's Tina with a Y. And then use the code Dr. Tina, and that'll get you 15% off any Qualia order. I love the Synolytic. That's what I've tried. The NAD Plus, I can't say that I have used appropriately, so I'm going to get on that and let you guys know, but really lovely products in there. And you've formulated all of them. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's my main role would be, I think my new title or current title is Senior VP of Product Development, but I originally thought of myself as the formulator, and that's still, the main hat I wear.
You're the mad scientist.
I am. And guinea pig number one. So.
Yes. Dr. Greg, Qualia mad scientist and guinea pig number one. I love it. Well, thank you so much for coming on my show today. And I always appreciate it. It's fun to nerd out with you and talk naturopathic medicine and foundations and always good stuff.
Thank you. Well, thank you again for having me back.
Thanks for listening to the Dr. Tina Show. This is a Wellness Loud production produced by Drake Peterson and mixed by Mike Fry. Theme song is by John the Guilt. You can watch the full video version of this podcast inside the Spotify app or on YouTube. As always, you can email the podcast at podcast@drtyna.com. That's DRTYNA. And if you like this episode, please rate, review, and subscribe on your favorite podcast app. You can also find all of my offerings on my website at drtyna.com. For more shows by my team, go to wellnessloud.com. See you next time, and thanks for listening. This podcast is for general informational purposes only. It does not constitute the practices of medicine, nursing, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical advice. I am a doctor, but I am not your doctor. No doctor-patient relationship is formed. The use of this information and the materials linked to this podcast is at the user's own risk. The content on this podcast is intended not to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Users should not disregard or delay in obtaining medical advice from any medical condition they have, and they should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such conditions.